Hello, everybody. I'm Mark Sachs, ELNET's Southeast Director, and I want to welcome everybody to ELNET's Monday briefing. We've got an interesting conversation with Ilan Berman today. Before we jump into it, one, I have to acknowledge we've got people from 9 different countries on today's call. And I have to give a shout out to Robert from Singapore. I don't know that we've ever had anybody from Singapore on this briefing, but you've outdistanced everybody and you're staying up to midnight to listen to this conversation with Ilan. So either you are a big Ilan fan or a big ELNET fan, and hopefully both. But we hope not to disappoint you, and thanks for joining. A couple of housekeeping points today. David Siegel is in Aspen this week. So if you are in Aspen, God bless you, enjoy it, and make sure to find David and go listen to him speak. I have a JNS article coming out today where I make the case that Europe is becoming a key geopolitical strategy for Israel. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts you'd like to share, by all means, reach out to me. Happy to discuss. And at the very least, spread it far and wide so people hear about ELNET, learn about what we're doing, and get to read why we're making the case that we are. That's all I've got for today. So I'm going to let today's discussion stand on its own merits. We're going to, open the conversation with Ilan Berman. Many of you know Ilan. He's a returning guest on our briefing. We've had him several times. I've known Ilan many, many years, and I think many on this call have also known Ilan for a long time. He is Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington. He's the author of the recently published book, The New Imperialists: How China, Russia, and Iran Are Trying to Remake the World. I'm going to let everybody else read the depth of his CV, but I think what you need to know is he's very well traveled, having recently traveled to Morocco, the Czech Republic, the UK, and will be heading to Serbia next week. He's an expert on all the issues that animate ELNET, and above all, he's just a really good guy with a fine taste for Georgian wine. So with that, Ilan,
That's the most
welcome
important thing.
back.
That's the most important thing.
Always. So next
Yeah,
time I come to DC, I know where we'll go for Georgian food and
right.
wine. So, I just mentioned the places that you recently visited. I will get to Iran. We'll get to Hezbollah. We'll get to the strategic significance of what's going on there. But I think it would be helpful to start more globally. I'd love to get your thoughts on your visits to each of these very diverse countries. If you're King Mohammed in Morocco, what are you looking at? If you're President Pavel in the Czech Republic, what are you seeing? If you're the incoming Andy Burnham, Prime Minister for UK, what's your outlook? So give us a sense of what you saw and what your thoughts are from each of those countries that you're visited. And what, by the way, since you're not there yet, you still have experience, I'm sure, with Serbia. So, offer some thoughts, what you expect to see from there.
Okay. Well, I mean, there's a lot, and so there's a lot in different places. So let me start with
Mhm.
Morocco because in many ways, I found that the most interesting because Morocco is, I think, very much a kingdom in a hurry, in the sense that they, over the last decade, they've developed a very fulsome strategy. The King Mohammed VI, has developed a really fulsome strategy to position Morocco as a multi-region player because we tend to think of Morocco in the context of North Africa. Now that it's part of the Abraham Accords, we think of it in the context of the Middle East. But Morocco by itself very much thinks of itself as an African powerhouse. And so if you look at a map, Morocco is geographically long and skinny. It looks not totally dissimilar from California in terms of its shape, but it is very much up until now has had a European orientation because its deep water ports are up in the north. They're in the Mediterranean, and so they're across from the Strait of Gibraltar from Europe. But Morocco sees itself as much more than that, and so over the last several years, the kingdom has really developed this southern strategy to, by the way, to capitalize on U.S. recognition of the Western Sahara, but also to build out the Western Sahara to make themselves a transshipment point, a commercial hub for the continent of Africa. and to improve their regional standing in the process, because this puts them at odds with China, for example, right? China is growing in influence on the continent. China is doing all its economic outreach to the countries of the continent. The Moroccans have this vision of competing with that. They have this vision of upgrading their military relationship with the United States, political relationship with the United States, but military is a big part of it. And the most interesting thing I heard when I was there 6 weeks ago or so was the first time I went to Morocco was like 2 decades ago. And right around the time when the US government was thinking about breaking off Africa Command from European Command. And the reason it was doing that at the time was because something like 70% of the military command's workforce was actually encompassed by the African continent. So they thought it was very smart to sort of to break it off, to create a different scope of work for military command dedicated to the African continent by itself. And at the time, I remember asking whether, the U.S. military was looking around for a regional base, and I remember asking national security officials in Morocco, "Oh, are you guys a good home for it?" And they immediately preempted my conversation. They said, "No, no, no, we're not. We have no interest in this. Everywhere you Americans go, Al Qaeda comes. So we don't want any part of that." And that was a really interesting thing to note, because we're fast forward 2 decades and it's very different, because now the Moroccans are moving fast. They're thinking differently strategically about how to engage with the United States. And so I had that conversation again, and all of a sudden, Moroccan officials seem enormously receptive to the idea, particularly if it's in the Western Sahara, the idea of a U.S. military base, because they want to secure American partnership. They want to expand the American stake in their country. And they have a really unsettled region, and they really want America to buy in and to support them. And so, at very much a time where in places like Europe, we see countries leaning away from the United States, in Morocco, very much they're leaning in. They're leaning into this sort of idea of partnership with Washington. So I found that really sort of a really interesting start to my summer travels. I mean, there's
Well, I
more,
suppose it
obviously,
does,
but
and I suppose it doesn't hurt that Al Qaeda and Boko Haram and every whatever the other Islamist organizations are already infiltrating the majority of North Africa. So they're
right, right,
already
right.
there. There's no
Well,
concern that they're going to move in.
they're already there. And the thing that I heard, which really sort of made my ears perk up, was the fact that Morocco sits atop, if you look geographically, sits atop this lawless region called the Sahel. And the Sahel is defined by transnational crime, right? Whether it's arms trade or drug smuggling or human trafficking, and this proliferation of jihadist groups. Um, on the other side of the continent, in East Africa, all of a sudden you're seeing a U.S. military presence already, and everything has to do with Iran, because when the war broke out, when the Iranians effectively shuttered, and then we kept shut the Strait of Hormuz via our military blockade, a lot of Gulf oil ported over to export out of the Red Sea. Right, the Saudis activated their East-West pipeline and ported something like 80% of their oil not through the Strait of Hormuz, but through the Red Sea. Now, the Red Sea is safer for now, but not necessarily so, right? That's not an indefinite condition, because the Houthis are there, right? They're a big Iranian proxy group. They're a big Iranian sponsored threat group. And so the U.S. military, for a while, for a few months now, has been thinking about establishing a military base on the east of the continent, right? In particular, they're talking to the Somalilanders, right, as distinct from the Somalis, right? Because Somaliland, the only country that recognizes Somaliland currently is Israel, but the U.S. military, right? I mean, but the Somalilanders are very hopeful that the U.S. will be the second one, and it's precisely because they're getting so much attention from the Pentagon. So when I was in Morocco on the other side of the continent, I heard a lot about that. I heard a lot about this idea that, hey, America, you could have a military base in the east of Africa, and you could also have it in the west of Africa. You sort of create this bridging function where you all of a sudden have this ability to reach out and touch all of these radical groups that are active in the middle of the continent, right? That's a really interesting sort of proposition to make to the Trump administration. And I think it's something that's likely to have a lot of legs.
Well, we seem to have ceded Africa to both China and Turkey. And I think we'll get to Turkey in a moment because I think we'll go through Europe and Turkey to get to the Middle East. But do you think that is us playing a game of chess here, that there's an opportunity for us to reassert ourselves in Africa as a counterbalance to where Turkey and China are going?
Well, it's interesting because, and by the way, it's not just China and Turkey. It's right. The Iranians are there as well. And actually, one of the most alarming things I heard when I was in Morocco was that the Moroccans, I this was before the memorandum was signed, and I remember asking these intelligence officials. I said, are you seeing a diminution of Iranian presence on the continent? And the answer was no. They're still here. They're still going strong, but they're talking differently. And I thought that was a really interesting comment. And I sort of wanted to drill down. And they said, Iran historically has been pursuing this sectarian strategy, right? Sectarian Shiite strategy, proselytizing, indoctrinating via, to Shiite communities, right? There's lots of Lebanese communities all over Africa, as there are in Latin America. But increasingly in recent months, we've seen them talk more about sort of general Islamic sort of solidarity, right? Opposition to the Abraham Accords, opposition to the United States, opposition to Israel. And that's very much the way the Iranians message to audiences in Latin America. It's why the Iranians have a presence in Latin America, despite the continent being 96% Catholic. And so the Moroccans were really concerned about the fact that the Iranians are also moving around in the continent, but they're no longer, giving a Shiite message. They're giving an Islamist message writ large. And, that was very alarming to them. And frankly, I think it should be to us, which is sort of a long way of saying it's absolutely true that we've retracted from Africa. And I think, frankly, part of that is because most of our recent engagement has been humanitarian in nature. So our withdrawal is very much a function of the fact that we've zeroed out the budget for USAID. So now all of a sudden we don't have a presence there. But the case that I have been making and other colleagues of mine have been making is that Africa is this continent of enormous promise, but also enormous peril. It is by 2050, because of the demographics on the continent, by 2050, 1 in 4 people in the global workforce is going to be African. And the continent is going to basically double in size over the next 4 decades. But at the same time, it's home to something like 50, 60 active conflicts, stretching from the east of the country all the way down to the south, all the way over to the west. And so you can't tap into that potential, that economic potential, if you don't have a greater security presence. And that's what the Moroccans want. That's what everybody else wants. And hopefully the administration's listening.
So let's ask, before we pivot to some of the other countries you visited, last question then, how is Morocco viewing Israel, sort of vis-a-vis its relationship with the United States? Is there a necessary causation here, or what is the correlation between its developing relationship with the United States and its relationship with Israel right now?
Well, the relationship with the United States is developing more, but it's very longstanding. Morocco, for those of you that don't know, Morocco was the first country to recognize the United States after the founding. So, for them, it's this sort of pride of place. The American legation in Tangier is the the first foreign outpost that the U.S. had. And so, there's a long history there, and they're very proud of it. But with Israel, it's very much a different thing. So Morocco, right, it's a monarchy ruled by the king. It's a sort of parliamentary monarchy, but they have a very strongly pro-Palestinian population. They head up the Al-Quds Committee and the Organization of the Islamic Conference. They have all these sort of Palestinian adjacent connectivity, and yet this is a government that, after October 7th, did not allow the Abraham Accords to fall apart. They have continued this conversation, and frankly, it's because they're in this mindset of growth and development, and they look at the Israelis and they don't like the politics. They have some problems with, rhetoric from certain parts of the ruling coalition. And yet they sort of understand that the startup nation, right, if they keep engaging, will work for them. And that's this model of pragmatism that frankly, I think is sorely needed elsewhere, because there's been a lot of, I would say, stalled momentum in a lot of what Israel's been trying to do over the last couple of years. It's unwarranted. Part of it is sort of, driven by divisive politics, but part of it is really this sort of risk aversion. But at least in Morocco, I heard the opposite message, right? They want to develop the Western Sahara. They want Israeli drip agriculture, drip irrigation. They want agriculture business. They want, to lean into AI, things like that, right? Israel's a leader in all that. So they're very receptive.
All right, let's move to the Czech Republic.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Thoughts from the Czech Republic, obviously a long-standing ally of
Right.
Israel's, and I think
Right.
Czech Republic has announced it's going to be the permanent veto at the EU. So give us your thoughts from your visit there.
It's interesting. I was there for less for research and more. I sit on the board of Radio Free Europe, so I was there very much for our summer board meeting. But I was there very much to sort of to listen, to look at the enterprise from an American perspective in terms of how we're messaging, the health of our messaging enterprise, and sort of what Eastern Europeans are looking at. And at least, listen, in the Czech Republic, just like in Poland, just like in the Baltic states, it's very clear to me these guys think that the bear is at the door. They think that the Ukraine war is not a self-contained conflict, and it's also not the end of something. It's the start of something. As in, if Russia is not halted in Ukraine, it will move elsewhere, right? And this is only exacerbated by the fact that, the Russians, Russian parliamentarians, Dmitry Medvedev, the very often drunk deputy chairman of the National Security Council in Russia, right? They make no bones about the fact that, the appetite comes with the eating. They see all of NATO's eastern flank, but certain countries in particular, and the Czech Republic is one of them, as a soft target, subject to infiltration, but also subject to subversion. And so, they're very concerned, and they're very worried about what they see as potential American disengagement, but they're also very worried about the opposite, right? Which is because of the way the Trump administration has navigated its relationship with Europe, which hasn't been the most pacific and the most settled. It's caused this counter reaction in what we would call old Europe, in France and Germany, this idea of strategic autonomy, right? And you sort of hear this a lot now, but it's a loaded term because it reflects strategic autonomy from the United States, right? Strategic autonomy by itself doesn't exist. It's basically you're articulating a separate path from America. And the Czechs are nervous about what this actually means for the Czech Republic as an ally of the United States, but also as an ally of America's allies, like Israel. What does it mean for them if you have this really sort of fundamental decoupling? What does it mean for them? Does it disadvantage them? So, I heard a lot of that.
So anybody on this on this briefing who's heard me speak, I've referenced the 5 macro trends, and one of them is strategic autonomy. And that was a case I made in this recent article, the importance for Israel to take advantage of this opportunity with Europe, but also because of Israel's need for strategic autonomy or independence from the United States. So it's interesting how Europe and Israel are pursuing this parallel track of strategic independence from the United States for different reasons, but still I think it's going to bode well between the two. What about the UK? What were your thoughts after visiting the UK?
So the state of the Union Jack, I think, is a little bit frayed these days, and it was really striking to me. I hadn't been since before the pandemic, so dog's lifetime, right? So I was really struck by the lack of health in the British political system, right? There was this, and this was, by the way, before Keir Starmer resigned. So but it was very clear the writing was on the wall. He was on his way out. He was giving interviews saying that he'll fight to the last breath. And everybody I talked to said, oh, no, he's going to be gone in a matter of days. And he was, because there's this failure to thrive. There's this generalized sense that there's a failure to thrive under Labour leadership. At the same time, you have Labour faces a political challenge from the Greens on their left flank. You have the Conservative Party, the Tories, which are doing slightly better, but still everybody remembers that they were the ones that saw, the country began its slide into its current political mess under their rule, under Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak. And so they now have a new leader, Kemi Badenoch, who's very energetic. She seems to be polling really well herself, but the party as a whole has a lot of ground to recover. They're being challenged the Tories are being challenged on the right by Reform UK, by Nigel Farage's Reform UK, which is, for lack of a better succinct explainer, is a sort of, MAGA-esque
Mhm.
party that's sort of, populist, grassroots, flirtation with some unsavory elements. But the even more concerning dynamic is that Reform UK is now being challenged on its right by something called Restore, which is very in bed with very unsavory elements, including neo-Nazi sympathizers and things like that. And so you see this fragmentation of the UK political scene. At the same time, so a lot of sort of Brits that I talked to didn't feel like they were being represented in terms of national politics. At the same time, they have had over the last 2 weeks basically what the U.S. had when President Biden decided not to run for re-election. Right? They've had a coronation. They had a staged managed by-election to give Andy Burnham a seat and the standing to, right, because in order to be prime minister, you have to have a seat in the House of Commons. And so he has now. He didn't have a seat before. They got a member of parliament to step down. They had a special by-election. They basically stage managed a seat for him, and now he's going to be coronated as the new prime minister sometime in the next 3-4 weeks or so. And so there's a lot of, the writing was on the wall already, but there was a lot of disaffection because lost in that mix is agency for the individual British voter, right? Even if you are a Labour voter, right, you don't feel like you're being represented. Sure, Andy Burnham seems a little cooler. He wears T-shirts, unlike you and me who are stuffy, he doesn't wear collared shirts. He wears T-shirts. He doesn't wear ties, but very short on substance and also very unrepresentative of the average voter because, frankly, the average voter didn't have much of a say. And so, I found the political health to be really lacking. And that has all sorts of implications for British defense and British national security, because you can't really expect, even if Burnham does become the prime minister, you can't really expect the UK to, be striding on the world scene if they're so divided internal, right? They have massive economic problems. They have massive problems with immigration. This Restore movement, this hard right Restore movement is talking about negative migration, right? Essentially, forcing mass deportation and things like that, right? So there's a lot of internal churn in the UK that suggests that it's not really going to be ready to sort of to play a partnership role for the United States the way we would like for a long time.
And yet it still has a seat on the UN Security Council. So a lot of power there, despite perhaps not having internal direction. So it represents a problem. So you're going to Serbia next week. Serbia, I believe I read last year, signed I think it was a $2.5 billion deal with Israel. Good signs there. What are you, as we head back east, because we're going to now head to Turkey after this,
Mm.
what do you expect to see from Serbia, and particularly its relationship with Israel?
Well, I thought that I think that the Serbian-Israeli relationship is one of the most interesting things that I've seen and I've encountered. First of all, I think it's necessary to say, right, more broadly, the Serbs are caught in a little bit of a geopolitical bind because of history, right? The Russian influence is very deep. Chinese infiltration is very deep. And the Serbs, right, at least on the surface, seem like a predictable actor, and yet they're not. The Serbian government, right, the government of President Vučić, has emerged as, working through third parties, right, mind you, so as not to make the Russians mad, has emerged as something like the third largest supplier of conventional weaponry to nation state supplier of conventional weaponry to Ukraine, right? They can't do it directly, but they can do it through third parties and things like that, right? So they have a stake in Ukraine. And by the way, the connection with Israel, right, coming to that, is very deep. The foreign minister, Marko Đurić, is a cousin of Elon Ohel, the hostage. And
Oh,
so he had a personal stake. He has made that relationship, the relationship with Israel, a personal agenda item, and it's really paying dividends. And on a broader scale, I'm really interested in countries like Serbia. Right, Serbia is not the only one, but there's others. There's Rwanda and other countries. countries that are trying to, right? They're smaller powers. They're trying to get out of this geopolitical trap of geography, of Russian influence, Chinese influence, trying to think a little bit differently. And they've hit upon this idea that Israel will really level up their game qualitatively, whether it's in terms of industry or in terms of tech innovation, or simply in terms of injecting them into a different conversation, a Middle Eastern conversation, an American conversation. So I sense a lot of growth opportunity there.
I find all of this really fascinating, and when I talk to people outside of this briefing, they find it equally as fascinating because it really is a Game of Thrones across 44 countries in Europe. Just the moving pieces and the dynamics and the geopolitical interests are all so different, but so complex that we could go through almost every country in Central and Eastern Europe and come up with a very compelling case. An interesting one, I think, you could make for Slovenia would be another one. I think an interesting, abrupt change in its relationship with Israel. All right, so let's go to Turkey, because what I want to talk about Turkey really is it's serving as host to NATO. Now, to me, this is pregnant with hypocrisy. It does not have a great human rights record. It aligns with Russia and with China. It is fomenting unrest across the Middle East. And yet, Europeans who hold themselves to a pretty high moral standard seem to be aligning with the devil here because because of strategic autonomy. They're moving away from the United States. They seem to be pivoting to Turkey because Turkey has the second most powerful military in NATO. Isn't this a Faustian deal that's going to come home to roost at some point? And how do you see this playing out over time?
It's interesting because I think that that number that you cited, the Turks being the second largest, second most powerful military in NATO, is I think exactly right, and it's one of the reasons why I think the Turks have such a free hand, right? Because all the things that you said attach, right? The Turks have a bad human rights record. The Turks are a sanctions evasion hub for Iran, which we cared about until like 12 minutes ago. The Turks are problematic on a whole bunch of other fronts. The Turks are imperialist. They have designs on Syria. The Turks have basically articulated eliminationist rhetoric vis-a-vis Israel. Right? There's all these problems with the Turks, but Europe is in this sort of caught in mid-stride, I would say, in terms of evolving its thinking about defense, because I think the Trump administration, and by the way, this isn't just, it has to be said, this isn't just a Trump administration priority. Every president since Bill Clinton has been talking about the need for Europe to step up and shoulder more of the burden for the common defense. Trump's just doing it in a more forceful way, and frankly, in a slightly more unpleasant way, diplomatically, right? So but the Europeans at long last are sort of understanding this notion. They're chafing at the fact that they're being brought to this moment, but they're sort of chafing. They're understanding this notion. But what they don't have really is very serious, immediate force projection capabilities, right? You have NATO for sure, but NATO requires men under arms, right? So if you're thinking about out of theater operations, if you're thinking about reinforcing the eastern flank, there are countries in the Baltic states, like the Scandinavian nations, who are very willing to fight, but the numbers are on the side of the Turks, right? It's much more numerous military, much more capable military. And so what you have is you have this incomplete transition that we're witnessing, where Europe is now at long last thinking correctly about defense spending, and is even making serious noises about building up a continental defense industrial base. But the one thing that we haven't really talked about and heard about is manpower, right? And manpower, especially if we're thinking about, the bear at the door on the eastern flank, the Russians coming across the transom, you need men under arms. And that's where the Turks sort of plug into the NATO equation. And I think that gives them a lot of latitude because they have a lot of men under arms. They have very capable training. It gives them a lot of grace that they wouldn't otherwise have.
It's Article 5 that really concerns the Europeans about the United States. That is all for one and one for all. If one's attacked, everyone defends. Is there real serious belief that if Russia were to attack Eastern Europe, Turkey would defend? I mean, is there a belief that that would happen?
Well, so it's interesting. Everybody I've talked to, they don't think that the Russians coming across sort of across the horizon, a la World War II, is the likeliest scenario, right? The likeliest scenario is the Russians nibbling on the edges of Eastern European sovereignty in ways that are actually difficult to pinpoint and difficult to identify a casus belli that would actually invoke Article 5. So there is that gray area. By the way, the Turks have a pretty fulsome relationship with the Russians as well, right? Which complicates that calculus. Like, how do you count on them to really sail to the rescue? But everything that I've seen in terms of what the Europeans are thinking about military deployments is so. And by the way, just as an aside, one of the most interesting things, as you know, Mark, I travel a lot. So I was in Lithuania in December, and the thing I heard there, because there's a NATO forward operating presence there, was the thing I got briefed by the NATO forward operating presence. They were talking about the difficulties with bringing NATO kit, NATO military equipment across the continent to reinforce the eastern flank. Um, and the number that really blew me away, and it's changed for the better since then, but the number that I was given in December, right, not that long ago, in December, was that in extremis it would take 45 days to transport heavy machinery, heavy military machinery from the west of Europe to the east, right? Because, the bridges aren't reinforced, the tunnels aren't wide enough because there's competing jurisdictions and things like that. And, to its great credit, the European Commission is working on streamlining everything to make that kit flow faster. But until it does, right, the Turks have a real role to play because of their geography. They have a real sort of ability to augment, or at least the hope is that they will augment if something goes down. And so my sense is that it's a proposition that NATO folks hope never will be tested, but they're hopeful.
Well, of course, and I don't want to get too much into this because I want to move on, but I think you may want to comment on this. The quid pro quo here is Turkey's going to want entrance into the EU. And the closer the EU gets with Turkey and the more bellicose Turkey becomes towards Israel, we've got a real challenge on our hands.
Well, so I don't know how settled the Turkish consensus is about being part of the EU. Personally, I think the Europeans a quarter century ago really had the opportunity to defang the current Turkish problem when the Turks made their noises about entering the European Union in the first place. And, the Europeans missed an opportunity here. And so now the Turks are on the outside. I think at least the government is currently constructed in Turkey may not want to be part of the EU for a very simple reason. They may not want, to have to bring, their court systems and their, legislature up to European code and things like that. But what they do want is they want the benefits of a closer relationship, right? So the debate that's happening here in Washington right now is the Turks, who are playing a role in the sort of a peripheral role in the Iran negotiations, but are increasingly a factor in terms of the U.S. Middle East calculus. The Turks, their quid pro quo is they want entry into the F-35 program, right, which is something that Congress has blocked them for a long time. And there's lots of reasons to keep them out, but they're giving that as the right of admission. And by the way, when we were looking at Finland and Sweden entering NATO, the reason they were not allowed to enter NATO for almost a year was because of that Turkish blocking veto, because the Turks were negotiating with the United States about doing precisely this, about getting better hardware, better equipment. So the problem that you have with the alliance is that there's certain parts of the alliance that see this as a partnership, like you have to hang together or you're going to hang separately. And there's other parts of the alliance, like Turkey, that see it as a very transactional sort of thing. Let's see how much we can squeeze the NATO partners to get what we want. And those two things are sometimes very much in tension.
Got it. Let's transition to the trilateral agreement between the U.S., Lebanon, and Israel. Before I do, I want to remind everybody, feel free to submit your questions. I will be turning to them shortly. All right, so I read the trilateral agreement, as I'm sure you have, and there were a couple of things that stood out to me as quite interesting, and I don't know if it gets enough play. So I'm going to read two parts, and there were in number 2, number 3, and number 4. There were a couple of interesting points. So the first one in number 2 is said, whereby the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces, will restore effective sovereign authority over all Lebanese territory, pending, emphasis mine, pending the verified disarmament of non-state armed groups. Okay? In number 3, upon the confirmation of successful disarmament of non-state armed groups and dismantlement of their infrastructure in these zones, the LAF will assume full and effective responsibility. And finally, the government of Lebanon will rebuild the state's monopoly on the use of force, achieve the complete and verified disarmament of non-state armed groups, and herewith request the support of international and particularly Arab partners under the leadership of the United States to achieve this outcome. So, two parts. One, the word pending means somebody else is going to do the work of getting rid of Hezbollah. It's not the Lebanese armed forces. On the first two, number 2 and number 3, it specifically sort of demotes the LAF and the government of doing that, relying on outside parties. And then it asks the Arab partners to get involved. Help us understand how this is actually going to work.
It's a good question. I'm not sure that I have a good answer. Clearly, the memorandum, as seen through the lens of entanglement, is a huge problem. It's a huge problem because the Iranians, for a long time, have been trying to to create conditionalities like support, reinforcement, or at least the preservation of their proxy network as part of the agreement with the United States. Those provisions that you read out, my sense is that's the American SOP to the Israelis, right? It's the acknowledgement that Hezbollah, the non-state actors, Hezbollah foremost among them, are active. There cannot be a vacuum. They need to be defanged. But the second part of that equation is that vacuum has to be filled, and it should be filled by the Lebanese armed forces, right? So this is the wordsmithing that goes into memorandums like this that allows America to tell the Israelis, hey, listen, we haven't thrown you under the bus in terms of your security in the north, but at the same time to tell the Iranians, no, we're gonna, we've linked the Lebanon front the way you've wanted, right? I don't think anybody, if history is any judge, I don't think anybody has a good idea about how to precisely to defang these non-state groups, right? Primarily Hezbollah. I think the language is open and will be interpreted by the Israelis as being, sure, we'll withdraw from Lebanon when Hezbollah is disarmed, right? Up until that point, we have freedom of action. Whether that rubs up against administration priorities, whether that makes it harder for the administration to move forward. We're like halfway into the 60-day ceasefire, almost halfway, that the memorandum laid out. I'm not seeing much tangible progress at all on any of the things that are supposed to happen next. But this could really be sort of a point of contention because the Iranians could come back and say, hey, look, we're not going to negotiate on the nuclear front. We're just not going to do it until Lebanon is more settled, right? And the Lebanese armed force, and there's no Arab force that's waiting in the wings to take over this sort of policing. So my sense is that the memorandum is at least partially wish casting. I think there's lots of other problems with it. So to my mind, the fact that it's mostly wish casting is not necessarily a bad thing.
I think it's obviously a huge win for Israel in this case. This begs the question then, what's the strategy? This potentially stands in the way of an MOU with Iran. We know that Iran purposely included Hezbollah into the MOU. It's interesting that it is trying to bring in the Arab states And in order to do that, my assumption is that you got concessions from the Arab states to at least a nod. Yes, we're in agreement here if you're going to include us in the MOU. So, look, I can't help but think people's impression of President Trump is like that visual illusion where some people see the witch and some people see the beautiful woman. If you're the witch, you say, there is no strategy behind any of this. He's way over his skis. He's lost this, and he's just let his two front guys go and kind of see who makes it. If you see the beautiful woman, you think Trump is just the most masterful strategist, whatever the word is, strategist out there. That this is all a master strategy to squeeze Iran into a place where they just can't checkmate anymore. That Hezbollah's out, Lebanon's out, Lebanon's out of the purview of Iran. Iran is getting squeezed. Help us make sense of what the strategy is here, and why would you send Vance in one direction and Rubio in another?
Listen, I think it's a good question. I would be lying to everybody if I said that I had a really good sense. My default is always that the truth lies somewhere in the middle. So, in this context, between the witch and the beautiful woman, right? I do think that the administration made a bunch of erroneous assumptions in the outset of the conflict, right? And by the way, I was a huge booster of sort of the early stages of this conflict, and just like Operation Midnight Hammer last year, right? Because I think that the Iranian nuclear program is an existential threat. I think if anything, the threat was underdefined, underexplained, because it wasn't just the nuclear program. It was also the ballistic missiles. And so, the sort of going after this capability was, I think, a prerequisite in terms of setting the table for a new region. And let's be frank, right? The reason we went back and did it again is because we didn't do as much damage as we thought we did last year, right? I don't care what the politicians say, but I think a lot happens in the interim, right? We're talking about a year's worth of time, and the administration got the sense, I think, that Iran would be easier to do than it is currently, right? Partially because Venezuela was such a cakewalk back in January, but also because they thought that this was going to be a time-limited exercise. So the sort of, to me, the marker was always that President Trump was supposed to go to China in March, right? Initially, and he delayed it by a month, because he assumed that he needed the conflict to be over so that he would have the leverage. He would be the one controlling the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. He could really sort of talk to Xi Jinping and set the table in America's favor. That didn't happen, and I think that's really sort of that the duration of the conflict has really sort of worked against the United States, to the point where the president wants some sort of settlement, right? And by the way, this is not necessarily an indefinite condition. I think there is an argument that says that the Iranians behaving poorly resets the clock, and the administration goes after them again. But at least in the interim, right, when all politics being local, the president's staring at a pretty tough midterm season. There's a lot of potential economic dislocation because of the price at the pump and things like that. I think there is this appetite to hammer out a deal. And by the way, totally understandably, the question is, the devil's always in the details. What's in that deal? Is it a delay of the Iranian nuclear program, or verifiable dismantlement? Is it a significant rollback of their ballistic missile arsenal, or does it not speak on it at all? What does it do with the proxies? Does it constrain American allies? Does it force America, as the early draft of the memorandum said, to reposition military bases? By the way, that parenthetically, that's actually a net win for Israel, because there's now conversations about America repositioning military assets and basing them in the Negev, right? And for America to serve as, what Ronald Reagan talked about as a land-based aircraft carrier for the United States in a real sense is actually a net positive, right? So there's many ways to slice this, but I think the story isn't written yet. To me, what's most worrisome is the longer this conflict drags on, the more emboldened the Iranians are, right? The more the narrative in Tehran is that they won and they can set the terms for the fees for transit through the Strait of Hormuz. We're already seeing the Saudis talking about hammering out a separate diplomatic agreement with the Iranians because they're worried about the Iranians,
Mhm.
funding the Houthis and things like that. What I worry is that the longer this sort of unsettled situation goes on, the more American leverage diminishes, right? And that can have real knock-on effects for us and for our allies over time.
And both parties are incentivized to mislead the public for their own, public
Absolutely. Yeah,
purposes, right?
absolutely.
And so it's very hard to understand what's actually taking place behind the scenes. I just want to remind everybody, continue to send in your questions. I'm going to start addressing them in just a moment. Before I do, I'm going to offer a very brief ELNET commercial. I know many of us around the world are paying attention to the World Cup. I know tonight many of people are going to get excited because the US plays Belgium. Many of you may have paid attention to the Tour de France kicking off on Saturday. So there are a lot of global events taking place that draw our attention away from important issues that ELNET is working on. But I want you to know we've not stopped. Over the last few weeks, we've held three major delegations. One requested by the German Bundestag's Defense Committee to take a delegation of female IDF soldiers to Germany to help them understand how to incorporate female soldiers into their military. And as Ilan said earlier, there's a real concern that the bear is at the door. And if 50% of your population is sitting on the sidelines, you have a problem. So Israel has been front and center, consulting with many of these countries on how to incorporate females into their military establishments. The second delegation, we took member of European Parliament, Christian Eller, who is the point man on Horizon Europe's fund. And over the last 5 or 6 years, Israel has benefited to the tune of $1.1 billion of funding from the EU Horizon Fund. And we took him to Israel to meet with counterparts and understand where those monies are going. And finally, we have on the ground right now a delegation of Greece, members of parliament, and other policy influencers. So we continue to do the work of making sure that European countries understand the importance, the strategic geopolitical importance of Israel to their national defense and security. We can't do this without your support. So I want to say thank you to all of you who are Diplomacy Club members. I want to urge you to become a Diplomacy Club member if you're not. Continue to spread the word about what ELNET is doing. We need your help. We need to grow. The future of Israel's safety and security depends a lot on our work. So with that, I want to say thank you. And I'll ask a question now from the always consistent John Mirish. And he asked a very interesting question here. I think it's something I think both of us have heard before, which gets to the root of the Sunni Shia conflict. How long can Sunni Shia work together before it becomes a problem here? So you mentioned that Iran is working in other countries promoting Islam regardless of the schism between Shia and Sunni. What are the fault lines there? How long can it work before it doesn't? And how should we
I
look at
think
that relationship?
right. So I think it's a good question. I think it's absolutely right to think about it as inherently adversarial. And by the way, the Iranians are nothing if not savvy, and so they sort of understand that their sectarian approach to engagement throughout the Middle East, but also in Africa, has bred a lot of resentment from the Sunnis, right, who are the majority in most places that they're involved in. So the innovation that my Moroccan friends were really concerned about was the fact that they're seeing more pan-Islamist messaging out of Iran, right? Iran was trying to delay that that tension with the Sunnis to try to take advantage of Sunni discontent with ruling governments and say, hey, I'm not advocating Iran as a Shiite state. I'm advocating Iran as a vanguard of activist Islamism. right? And you can get behind that, right? And so the problem with that is if that strategy is successful, and it's early days, so we'll have to see. But if that strategy is successful, the Iranians will be able to tap into a much broader network because the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, has built a very extensive network around the Middle East and Africa, which is Sunni in nature, but it has many of the same ideas, this anti-state, anti-Western ideas that the Iranians are evangelizing. So if the Iranians are really successful, then I think they can have far greater resonance than they've had up until now. And nothing succeeds like success, right? So if the Iranians had really been knocked down a peg or two as a result of the current conflict, their ideology would be bankrupt. What I'm concerned about is the fact that there's a appearance of Iran as being both consolidated and inevitable that now exists in the Persian Gulf, for example. And the more that's locked in, the more there's a sense that the Iranians are a force to contend with, the more their ideology has broader appeal, right? So that's something we have to watch out for.
And I think if we look back in history, the rule has always been, I guess, Islam stands together against the kafir, but then we'll war against each other when the
Right.
kafir is gone. Iran has aligned with Al Qaeda throughout the Iraq War, Afghanistan War. So there's certainly alignment between Shia and Sunni going back centuries when the opponent has caused a threat to Islam, kind of writ large. Where do you talk to us about what Europe should be thinking with regard to Lebanon and Iran? Where is Europe right now? France, which has a natural relationship with Lebanon, kind of cultural history, linguistically, politically, historically, is really on the sidelines here. So where does the EU or particularly European countries go to help Lebanon extract itself from the pull of the Iranians?
No. I think that's exactly the right question. It's not a question that's being asked in Europe. And by the way, the French are in strategic retreat, not just in terms of diplomacy in the Middle East. They're in strategic retreat in Africa, right? Where they've really had, the sort of, countries like Mali, countries like Burkina Faso have kicked them out in recent days. And instead, they've put all their chips on support from Russia, right? What used to be known as the Wagner Group before the late unlamented Yevgeny Prigozhin had that plane, he had the abortive coup and he had the sort of the plane explode in midair. His mercenary outfit is now under the direct control of the Russian Ministry of Defense, and they are trying to work in all these places in Africa where countries like France have withdrawn from, right? And to try to secure them, but they're not doing a very good job. So, for example, 6 weeks ago in Mali, you had an Al Qaeda franchise take over parts of the country, right, and rout the Russian mercenary troops that were stationed there. That's really, that's bad news for the Russians, but that's good news for everybody else because there's opportunity there for European countries and for the United States too, to sort of to step in and be a stabilizing presence, a security presence. And I think the same holds true in Lebanon. I don't put much stock in the idea that there's going to be a pan-Arab force that really disarms Hezbollah and stabilizes the south of Lebanon. But it does become a much more achievable objective if we broaden the aperture. If we say, you know what, maybe not a pan-Arab force, but maybe this is something the Europeans can weigh in on as well, right? Sometimes to make a problem smaller, you have to make it bigger. And so, the problem that I see is that the Europeans are not yet really asserting themselves in foreign policy terms in a way that would really give them greater resonance or resonance again in places like Lebanon. So hopefully they can.
Well, they're running out of time because UNIFIL is due to depart December of 2027.
That's
Yeah, I
right.
think the end of 2027. So you've got a year and a half to figure out what Europe's role is going to be. We've got a question here from Charlie Rose. Pardon me while I bring it back up here. I got to find it for a second. It's on my screen. So his question is from the New York Times front page. It said, quote, challenges for Jewish museums in Europe. Apparently they're facing a ton, not unexpectedly, of anti-Semitism as fronts for Israel, essentially. I can't imagine you're going to have the solution to this because I think we're all in search of the solution. But what are your thoughts? How do we counter something like this? And is it counterable
It
given this cultural phenomenon that we are dealing with?
No, and this is sort of a profound thing because like everybody else, I'm sure on the call, I've been sort of thinking, puzzling through this for a long time now. Um, I'm a product of the Soviet Union, right? My parents were Soviet refuseniks, and I remember growing up, they would tell me all the time that the safety of Jews everywhere depends on a strong Israel. And I remember sort of scoffing at this and sort of like, oh, we're in America. This is not, whatever it is. And then I had to call them after October 7th, and I said, you know what? You're absolutely right. And I think uh, Jewish, Jewish communities in the diaspora are experiencing this as well, where there is this. I think we have to admit that first of all, we took our eyes off the ball in the service of assimilation, whether it's in the United States or Europe. We took our eyes off the ball of the fact that there were hostile groups that meant us no goodwill that were organizing. Right? It's okay for there to be protests against the Israeli government. It's not okay for this to blow out into a broader anti-Semitism, or for there to be uh, community groups that are organized by Muslim civic organizations like there are here in the United States that provide talking points, provide tents, provide sort of all this stuff to do that build. I think that extends to institutions, right? We haven't really thought through how to secure our institutions, and we're only beginning to now. I remember going. So we were talking about the UK before. I remember going to the UK a decade ago, 15 years ago, and learning about the community trust, which is the security apparatus that the government funds to provide protection for synagogues, right? And at that time, there was nothing like that in the United States. There weren't even, during Shabbat services, there was maybe a squad car to do crowd control, to at the traffic light. There was nothing. And I had a friend who said, you know what? That's coming to you. That's coming to you. And I didn't believe him at the time. I believe him now. And the question is, how do we sort of group together? How do we figure out a workable solution? I don't have a good answer for the museum question, but it does seem to me that, the old axiom is that in order to sell somebody aspirin, you first have to convince them they have a headache. And I think we finally figured out that we have a headache, and we have to, sort of do some serious planning, some serious soul searching, some serious community reshuffling in order to, secure these institutions and in order to sort of make our community members safe.
Can I make a comment? Can I make a comment? This is Charlie
Oh,
Rose. Can I make one comment?
well, oh, Charlie, you're on. Go ahead.
Just want to make one comment because when you read the article, I'm not as smart as you guys. When you read the article is saying openly that the history of the Jewish people in each of these European countries is illegitimate. And the state of Israel is to be causing a problem that further delegitimizes its own history. So this is not only a delegitimization of the Jews in their own, in Denmark and Belgium and France and so forth, it's delegitimizing Jews in the entire world. This is
Yeah.
outrageous. And it's the same delegitimization that occurred in the 1930s that the Germans began, and it's the delegitimization that happened in the diaspora in the 12 and 13 and 1400s that happened in medieval Spain. So it's an old, what they say in Yiddish, an alte Geschichte, an old story that's repetitive once again, and we're allowing it to occurring in democracies, not in bad places, but in places that are supposedly democracies. And that's the part that's so scary and sad. That's the only
Yeah,
point.
Charlie,
I'm sorry. I
thank you.
apologize.
No, that was fine. There's reasons to get emotional about this. We all appreciate the
I
question
apologize.
and your
I
comments and your
apologize.
sentiments. That is why I asked, can we even counter this cultural phenomenon? Because it is, in fact, a cultural phenomenon that all Western democracies are contending with right now. We are seeing it in this country. You just had to listen to a certain mayor's July
Right.
4th speech to know that
I listened
we're
to it.
dealing with it. But these are challenges for sure. We're running low on time, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to ask Ilan one very quick question that I want you to answer quickly if you can. Before I do, I just want to let everybody know next Monday, we are going to have Reza Asghari, who's an Iranian German economist and member of the German Bundestag. He will be with us next week. And then I'll turn it over to Tom for some closing remarks. All right, Ilan. Well, coming after Charlie's question, which certainly raises the specter of nothing good, I would like to know if there's anything you're optimistic about. Give us something good to end on.
Right. So, okay. So it's a hard job, right? Mark, you and I have known each other for a long time. I tend to be a glass half empty kind of guy, but I do think that there's great merit in the notion of working the problem, right? Like we have a problem, right? Whether the problem is, we're dealing with anti-Semitism, or the problem is that, foreign policy is not heading in the proper direction, right? We have to figure out what the proper strategy is. And one of the really interesting things to me that I was sort of thinking about this morning was, do you remember when what was it, November, December, when Bibi Netanyahu gave that speech where he talked about how Israel has to turn into a super Sparta, right?
Yeah.
And everybody was like, oh, that's terrible, whatever it is. He was onto something. He was onto something because he saw this sort of foreshadowing. He saw these winds swirling, and he understands. And by the way, he's not the only one, right? But he understands, and I think there's a lot of merit in this idea that Israel is still the startup nation, right? Very much so. But the startup nation is different, right? Because of anti-Semitism, because of anti-Israel sentiment. That doesn't mean that Israel is isolated, but it does mean that Israel has to interact with the world differently. So, for instance, right, if the Israeli high-tech sector was what drew all this foreign direct investment in the past and all that stuff, you know what's going to draw it in the future? It's going to be AI. It's going to be defense. It's going to be cyber. It's going to be the things, right? And again, we would love for people to invest in Israel because they love Israel, right? But the reality is, this is a problem, right? This current these things go in waves. So I'm over the long term, I'm very optimistic. But the way we weather this current wave is you make Israel indispensable on the things the international community needs, right? And you create that breathing room that allows you to work on things like a new narrative for our history, securing our communities, things like that, right? But like my parents said, right, intimately connected.
Well, I'll sum that up with a bit of my version of optimism because you're talking about the marketplace of ideas. I do believe the marketplace of ideas works. I think it's a little dysfunctional right now, but over the long run, the marketplace of ideas work. And we generally have the good ideas. And I mean, we as people who think like us, I think Israel is on the side of ideas. The United States, broadly speaking, and Western countries are on the right side of the bright ideas in the marketplace. So over time, I believe we will win out, and that's why we continue to do what we do. So I'm sorry I couldn't get to everybody's questions today. Tom, if you're on, the floor is yours to say some closing remarks. Ilan,
Yeah,
always fun, always learn something and appreciate
My
your
pleasure.
time and wisdom.
okay. First of all, I want to thank Ilan again for a great session. Mark, you did a fabulous job with this whole presentation. I don't want to be viewed as coming on and cutting off all those that are in line for questions because we just ran out of time. So I'll just make it very quick. We look forward to Ilan joining us again. I remain optimistic that Israel will continue to take a position in the world where it produces something that it has a demand. And as long as they're able to stay in front and do that, I feel that they'll be important. So many things. By the way, Mark, I just want to say real quickly, the Aspen, we talked about the people in Aspen today, many of our supporters. We have the annual Aspen event that is sold out every summer. It's a really a wonderful event. And if anybody has an interest, who's listening today, then contact us and make arrangements early because it sells out. And I just wanted to wish everybody, I hope you had a nice Independence Day. I hope we all understand that the basis of the Constitution of the United States is really based on a lot of Judaic values, and that we share in that independence. And God bless America and God bless Israel. And we hope that our respect for humanity prevails, and this rhetoric against what they talk about what we are and what we are not. It is, in my opinion, is a basis for good relations and the way people should live and exist together. Mark, you mentioned something about like thinkers and people on this call. We need people who lead others who are not like thinkers to understand why we stand for what we stand. And that's the educational process that we provide to our listeners. And it's our responsibility to spread that through our friendships and people that we know so that they understand. And this rhetoric that's going on, what's going on in college campuses, and what's going on in educating our youth against Israel is horrible. And so I hope that goodness will prevail. And Israel, God bless Israel. Israel High. And so with that, I say, have a nice week and go to work and push for the things that represent Israel and the strength of Israel and the EU and all those countries that have humanity as their top interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Have a wonderful week, everybody. We'll see you next Monday.